The Nintendo 64 was released in 1996 and was officially discontinued in 2002. While it didn't dominate the market in the same way the Super Nintendo did, losing in overall sales to the Sony PlayStation, the Nintendo 64 was home to some of the greatest, most innovative, and influential games of all time. Super Mario 64 set the gold standard for 3D platformers with its smooth analog controls, dynamic camera system, open-ended level design, and at the time, its jaw-dropping visual fidelity. There have been quite a few 3D Mario games released since then, and while many of those were great, many people would argue that Super Mario 64 is still the king of them all. GoldenEye 007 is often considered the best ever video game adaptation of a movie, thanks largely to Rare's developers recreating movie locations with impressive accuracy. On top of that, back then, first-person shooters were often considered PC territory, but this game proved that home consoles could deliver an outstanding, uncompromised FPS experience. Plus, there was the advantage of having 4-player split screen, which was extremely ambitious in those days. Oh, and of course, you can't talk about GoldenEye without mentioning the soundtrack. And the list goes on and on. I mean, Ocarina of Time, Paper Mario, Super Smash Bros. This thing was an absolute powerhouse of legendary, genre-defining video gaming excellence. But what's it like playing the Nintendo 64 nowadays? I mean, most TVs only have HDMI, and the N64 by default only works with Composite or S-video cables. You can use dinky little adapters like this one that came with my TV, but they don't tend to look very good. Some LCDs support S-video, which is a big step up from Composite, but blown up on a big screen, these low resolutions don't tend to look as good as they did on the CRTs they were originally designed for. While it is hard to capture just how good the CRT looks with a basic iPhone camera, anyone who's ever used one will know that there's just no matching their charm. Even with a cheap composite cable, the CRT manages to look absolutely fantastic. Now, a lot of people choose to emulate Nintendo 64 games. It's convenient and fairly easy to do, plus it doesn't even require owning an actual Nintendo 64, just a $1,000 computer instead. And if you want to simulate that CRT aesthetic, there are certain shaders and overlays that you can apply to the screen to mimic the experience. But I like original hardware, and while I do have a little CRT that I like to use from time to time, I like to do most of my gaming on a nice, big, modern display. So how do we do that without sacrificing too much in terms of image quality? A popular solution would be to install an HDMI mod, which can be a bit pricey and complicated, but once it's done, it offers unparalleled convenience and vastly superior image quality. But if you have a bunch of retro video game consoles like I do, then the cost of installing an HDMI mod inside all of them might be a bit too much to bear. So what I chose to do was to buy a cheap scaler from AliExpress. This is the Retro Scaler GBS-C Pro. It cost me about $130 Canadian, and it can convert and upscale just about any analog signal to HDMI. It does composite, S-video, RGB, component, SCART, and even VGA. This way I figure I can use it for all of my consoles instead of just, focusing on the one console. The problem is, composite and S-video look like absolute trash on this thing. The video doesn't really do it justice, but trust me, it's bad. Everything looks dark and completely washed out, and no, it's not just my unit. This problem is actually frequently discussed in the product reviews and on RetroScaler's official Discord. I don't know if it's a hardware issue or a software issue, but so far none of the firmware updates I've done have resolved it, so I'm just staying away from composite and S-video for the time being. Now, the good news is every other type of cable works perfectly, so I decided to get myself a SCART cable. Yeah, this big-ass connector, it's called SCART. There's just one problem, though. The SCART cable carries an RGB signal, which the Nintendo 64 can't output without some physical modification. Which is strange, actually, because its predecessor, the Super Nintendo, actually had native support for SCART cables, but it's actually a cheap and easy thing to get around. You just have to buy a little circuit board and solder it into your Nintendo 64. Most systems are compatible with it, but it's a good idea to make sure that your model number is actually compatible, otherwise you might need to buy a different version. I got mine from AliExpress. It was about $19 Canadian, and that included shipping, so I've put a link to it in the description in case you're interested in getting one yourself. So now that the Nintendo 64 is modded and I've got my SCART cable hooked into the scaler, I can finally play this thing up on my big screen. And you know what? It was frickin' worth it. This thing looks absolutely stunning. I mean, sometimes I'd be playing this thing and my friends would come over and they'd ask me if I was using an emulator. It's that good. And this isn't even a particularly high-end scaler like a RetroTink. It's just some cheap thing off of AliExpress. But by God, it gets the job done. It even has the option to add these little scan lines, which can help simulate a bit of that CRT aesthetic, which, in my opinion, is an absolute must use. So if you want a cheap scaler and don't mind the fact that it sucks at composite and S-video scaling, then I really do recommend the Retro Scaler GBS-C Pro. I've put a link for it in the description if you want to check it out. Alright, so we're all hooked into a nice modern TV with great picture quality, but we're still stuck using these wired controllers, right? Well, wrong, actually. Meet the Retro Scaler Blue Retro wireless adapter. It has 4 controller plugs and supports just about any Bluetooth controller you can think of. I like to use Nintendo's wireless N64 controller for the Nintendo Switch, and it even has rumble support, which is pretty cool. However, if I really want to upset the balance of the universe, I could always use this PS1-styled 30th anniversary controller for the PS5. And the worst part is, this isn't even the most cursed thing I've ever done. But if you're interested in getting one of these adapters for yourself, I got mine on AliExpress for about $29 Canadian. I've linked it in the description if you want to check it out. Now, we've covered just about everything, but there's one more thing that you may have noticed about my Nintendo 64, and that's the cartridge that I'm using. This is the Summer Cart 64. It's part of a growing wave of open source and multi-function cartridges that expand what the Nintendo 64 can do. This particular project was started by a Polish developer named Mateusz Faderewski. It's completely region-free, and it can play standard Nintendo 64 ROMs, Nintendo 64 disk drive games, and other homebrew apps and games. You just load everything onto a micro SD card, pop the cartridge into your console, and pick the game of your choice from this simple menu. I've put a link to the GitHub page in the description below. So, that's it. This is how I've given my good old Nintendo 64 a new lease on life in the modern day. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, please consider subscribing for more content. Feel free to leave me a comment and a thumbs up, and as always, thank you for watching.